Okay, thank you so much, Martin, and thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar. I'm going to discuss some topics with you today, and we're going to talk about when it is time for the association to update their reserve study. How do the component and financial status of the association create the need for update? And what is the best type of study needed to satisfy the needs of the association? Most associations at some point will consider an update to their current reserve study. The task then begins of reviewing proposals by competing reserve study providers, and like many association board of directors do, they sometimes put too much emphasis on the cost of the update and not enough focus on the purpose or benefit of an updated roadmap for the future funding, which is going to impact the community more significantly than focusing just on the price of the study. Generally in a community, conditions change within the community, and they can and will change over time regarding both the component status and the financial condition of the reserves. This is the main reason for considering a reserve study update. Whether the perceived need is a level 1 or a level 2 study, the quality of the available data from prior studies needs to carefully be scrutinized by the reserve specialist preparing the proposal. Deciding whether the level 1 or the level 2 study will support the needs of the community can generally only be fully determined based on the quality of the initial study performed. So the old saying, garbage in creates garbage out, that holds very true as it relates to reserve studies. All of our site visits that are conducted by USI Commercial, as well as the reporting process that we used, are performed according to CAI standards. And depending on when the previous study was performed, we'll offer level 1, level 2, or level 3 study. If the previous level 1 study was performed more than 5 years ago or beyond, we'll recommend a new level 1. The reason being is that conditions, both financial and component related, may have undergone significant changes during that period of time. USI Commercial believes that funding studies are an essential part of the property management process. People, meaning the association board, and the property are continually changing and evolving. And as a result of that, the useful life of a funding study is generally not more than 5 years. It's recommended that the reserve study be evaluated on an annual basis and updated when one of the following events occur. Changes in interest rates. This is important because if interest rates rise, that of course is going to increase the cost of components and maintenance associated with repairs or replacements on the property. The same token applies to changes in inflation rate. If the inflation rate increases, generally that's going to increase the cost of components and also the cost of labor. Changes in the number of dues paying members. An association can have, say hypothetically, 50 members. And if there are unusual circumstances where they have foreclosures or members are delinquent in their payments for significant periods of time, that's going to impact the financial health of the community. Also, before starting major capital improvements, possibly there might be capital improvements that weren't necessarily outlined in the study, and those, because funds weren't put aside for them, could again impact the financial health of the community. Also, studies would want to be updated before making major changes to the property. An example of that might be adding, say, a tennis court on the property, or a community that has a swimming pool. The association and community might decide that they want to add a spa or a wading pool for children. Again, that would require an update to the reserve study. Things like catastrophic fires or floods, because insurance may not totally cover the cost of retrofit, those monies would have to come either from the reserve monies or from special assessments or from loans. After a change in ownership or management, if the community changes property management companies, that would be a reason for a reserve study update, because the style of the management companies certainly may differ. That also applies to ownership of the property. And finally, after any changes in corporation or municipal annex, if the roads in a community were at one time maintained by the public utility, by the entity that manages the roads in the county or the city, and then turn them over to the community, that's going to be added cost for seal coating and mill and overlay. So those are some reasons why a reserve study would want to be updated. The Level 2 study would be recommended if the original Level 1 study were performed no longer than 5 years ago. And we would have to add at our disposal high quality data from the Level 1 study. So in other words, if the Level 1 study did not contain good quality data, it would be difficult to do a Level 2 study, even though that requires a site visit. The Level 3 study doesn't require a site visit, and therefore that should really be used for minor updates to the Level 1 or 2. And some examples of that could be some minor financial changes or minor component changes. A Level 3 study would suffice to do that update. USI Commercial, although, does not perform Level 3 studies on a property unless we performed the Level 1 or Level 2. The reason being is that we would not have sufficient data to be able to produce a quality Level 3 study. Long-lived items are those that have a useful life that will exceed the time period of the reserve study. And some examples of this would be possibly concrete walkways, masonry retaining walls, some types of exterior cladding. If buildings had brick exterior cladding on them, generally tuck pointing, which is where they would improve the quality of the mortar between the bricks. Usually that has a serviceable life of about 30 years. So in most cases, major tuck pointing would not have to be done during the course of a reserve study. When a new Level 1 or repeat Level 2 study is performed, some of those long-lived items may no longer be considered long-lived. As an example, if we were talking about concrete walkways and the study was a 30-year study, the community was already 30 years old. Typically the life expectancy of concrete is about 50 years, so that concrete would be in need for major retrofit or replacement during the course of that study. So that then no longer would be considered a long-lived item, and it would require an update. It's extremely important for the reserve analyst who is performing the site visit to be presented with accurate data related to the original age of long-lived components. This will allow for an accurate remaining life valuation at the time of the new study. And a component that has been designated as a long-lived item in a report, again, may now be within the upcoming cycle for retrofit or replacement. As mentioned in this presentation earlier, changes within the community with respect to component age and condition are going to warrant updates in the reserve study. The cost of repair, replacement of component changes, and in some cases from year to year, especially things like roofing and asphalt, as the cost of those components is based on the price of petroleum. So as the price of oil goes up, the price of asphalt shingle roofing or rolled roofing is going to go up, and certainly the cost of surfacing asphalt roadways. Your original reserve study will have costs for repair and replacement based on the age and condition at the time of the study. So these costs will change over time, and as in the case with most association, boards change along with the idea of how to manage the community. So having an accurate, updated reserve study to hand to the new board is going to give them a sound roadmap for navigating and keeping the community in a state of financial health. Not only are the components going to change, but over time finances change as well. And again, the original reserve study outlines the financial condition at the time of the study and projects that condition out for the course of the study based on the original financial numbers entered. Conditions in community financial status can and will change due to a myriad of reasons and circumstances. And with those changes comes the need to update the reserve study. USI Commercial uses the full funding or the component funding method in our reserve study reports. The reason is that with full or component funding, the association has a little more flexibility and latitude for the current and successive, and also for current and successive boards. And by latitude, it means that the numbers can be tweaked as the study goes on. The full or component-based funding plan sets the reserve funding goal of attaining and maintaining reserves at or near 100% funded. Obviously, communities generally are not always year after year after year going to be 100% funded, but in that percentage funded, we try to gauge the health of a community based on that community being better than 60% funded in their reserves over longer periods of time. So if that percentage funded falls below 60% for extended years, that could indicate that there's less financial health in the community. Full funding is generally viewed as the most conservative approach. And one thing that we don't recommend is changing the funding method midstream with updates. Keeping the same funding method is important. And the reason being is that if a 30-year outline is put into place using a particular funding method, it could cause some financial issues, again, changing in midstream. There are many different types of funding methods. Three of them that are fairly common in addition to the full funding are threshold funding, and that establishes a reserve funding goal of keeping the reserve balance above a specific dollar or percent funded amount. Depending on the threshold, this is usually less conservative than full funding. Then we have baseline funding, and that establishes a reserve funding goal of keeping the reserve cash balance above zero. And this is generally viewed as the least conservative funding approach. Another type would be statutory funding, and that establishes the reserve funding goal of setting aside the specific amount required by local statutes. And this type of funding plan may not be acceptable in a number of states, depending on whether or not they have governing rules related to reserve studies. So, concluding, you can see the decision to update a reserve study is dependent on the component life valuations, escalating or decreasing costs of repair or replacement, and changes in the financial status of the community association. Your reserve specialist can advise you regarding whether it's time to do an update and what type of study would best serve the association needs.